So you think AI is going to take your job? That all programmers are going away because of AI? I might be the last one to be doing a video on this, but I've got some thoughts. Let's get started.
Just take it easy, man.
You can't handle the truth.
Forget it, Donnie. You're out of your element.
That's just my opinion. I could be wrong.
Let's start the conversation about what programming really is. Are we a coder? Are we a software developer? Are we a software engineer? It's a lot of these words that get bandied about without a lot of thought. We focus in this industry a lot on titles, not a lot on skills. And so those titles become important. What's the difference between a junior developer and a senior developer? What is an architect? What does all that mean? There are no real standards for that, so we have different companies handling it in different ways. At the end of the day, I think when we start in this industry, we start by focusing on the actual code. The text that you type in some editor that gets compiled into something that a machine can understand. And over time, I think we start to see how much of that work is repetitive. We find patterns. We repeatedly apply those patterns to the kind of programming we want to do. Ultimately, many of us move up that ladder to where we can start handling more interesting problems, how to architect a system, how to secure a system, how to do these things depending on where you're at that understand the system in sort of a gestalt sense, the whole picture all at once. So this comes back to the idea of what does AI have to do with any of this, right? I know we've all looked at ChatGPT and we've been using GitHub's Copilot or other tools like it, and it's not all that new. You could argue that maybe IntelliSense was the first sort of step towards programming being AI driven, or at least machine learning driven. But I want to talk about sort of how we get here and where I think AI belongs. So I'm old. I know some of you watching this may be old, but I feel old these days. I got my first job back in 86, 85 or 86. It's hard to remember anymore. And I remember when I got started, a lot of the first things you learned when you were programming was what the hardware was. What is the hardware that you need to run code on? And then ultimately, we wrote machine language. And then that became very laborious. We wanted a way of making that a little better. And then came this idea of writing code that's going to be compiled down into what the machine can understand. And then it came down to this very fundamental idea that we could write something that wasn't the exact thing the machine need to know about, but that we could then translate that into something the machine could. So it'd be easier to write, because writing individual bits, maybe even being concerned about stack and heap and registers and all of that wasn't very productive. And so the first languages came out. COBOL was made by Grace Hopper back in the day. You saw other languages like Pascal being introduced. And the idea behind these was really, let's write it in a way that we can take the intent of the programmer and move forward with it. And some people were very against this because it assumed that those languages are going to waste some efficiencies in taking that code we're building and moving it into this other thing. In the same idea, we started to get into this idea of writing code in something like English. Now, of course, these days, talking about it just being English is sort of an issue, and how that translates to across the world. But this was mostly happening in the UK and the United States. And so the thought of writing things in plain old English. And this is where products like BASIC came in, and where higher level languages for databases like DBase2 and Clipper started to come in with this idea of, I can really think about the data structures as something I care about, but not necessarily how the bits are actually being moved. And that when someone read that code, there was an English sense of it, that an if statement was clear what it was, and a loop looked like this, and a switch looked like this. All these basic constructs that told us about what the code looked like, and then someone was going to be responsible for figuring out how to execute that at the machine level. So if we've gone up these steps, we're getting further and further away from the core thing that you think about what we do for a living, which is write code that machines can execute, right? Object-oriented programming, and ultimately components, ActiveX and Java Beans, and every system had their own. Then we had things like Common Core that sort of were trying to do things like distributed objects. And there was a famous paper that came out about the end of all developer jobs, that it was going to be so easy to just wire up components together that even secretaries would start to write code. Everyone would write code because it wasn't a specialist job anymore. And as we all know, we also have lots of developer jobs out there. And so I want to talk about that in the sense that this is not a new argument. For some reason, there's insecurity in the Java development thinking that something's going to replace us. And so far, we've been good. But we've also, so far, moved up this chain of understanding the individual pieces we care about, right? Without having to know the lower level semantics of it. Sure, the Moore's law making computers more and more powerful allowed us to be inefficient in some ways with the opportunity to build better systems. Then we had sort of a big change. Java, C#, other languages sort of in that realm were saying, you know what? You've been doing a lot of work to manage memory. I don't think you're good at it. Buffer overruns are super common. And maybe we should take the responsibility out of most developers from actually worrying about memory. And that is a time where we came in and went, oh, we can just write logic. We no longer have to track every object when we create it and when we just destroy it. And we hope that the garbage collection is going to be good enough. And early on, it might have not been quite good enough, but as we've gone the last 20 years with it, probably 25 now, it's gotten better and better and better. And a lot of the languages we deal with now are all garbage collected to some respect, so that tedium of memory management has gone away as well. So again, another higher level. I'm just writing the code, not worrying about how much memory we have access to, not worrying about leaking memory. We're going to rely on some system to be able to handle that for us. And in this age where we started to build these things, we started to think about deploying applications off the computer that it was written on, right? We started to get into this idea of deploying to data centers and deploying via install scripts where people were going to install these on separate machines. And we had to become very aware of both browsers for web development and OSs for not web development. So all the other things you might want to do. And then we came up with this bright idea of containers. And I've often thought about containers in maybe a different way than a lot of other people, because all containers did was say, you now no longer have to worry about the OS. I'm going to give you a box to throw your code in, and I'm going to promise you I'm going to execute it. So as these responsibilities sort of are peeled like an onion, we're still able to do that core job that we want to do and that, frankly, we're good at. Some of those other housekeeping parts of programming just aren't well suited to the people who have this sort of mercurial thinking that makes them good programmers. So that leads us to today. In today's world, we have this idea that AI might be coming for our jobs, just like components before it, just like higher level languages before it, all this idea that we'd be more efficient. And the reality is, all we've done in the past, 35 years that I've been in the business, is we've allowed ourselves to not worry about the small details so that our systems could become more complex as our world got more complex. The idea of deploying into a data center that somebody else knows, and you're going to magically package that up so it can be deployed in a simple way. That's the world we live in now. And I don't think we could have done that if we were still writing just above that machine layer. So I think looking at things like Copilot, ChatGPT, and other things like it are going to benefit us as developers. We're going to be able to think and rely on these large data sets, certainly not perfect data sets, but these large data sets to go, I bet someone else has done this. In fact, I would argue that all AI is really going to affect is the things that we used to rely on, things like Stack Overflow, articles, blogs, and books. By being able to go to something and type in, I need to sort a linked list, and it be able to produce that code, all it's doing is shortening that time between you searching for it, looking for it, and then having access to it, and using that to inform your own code choices. It also means that I think as AI becomes better at writing code, we're going to be in that sort of magic realm, in fact, for me, a more enjoyable realm of looking at large systems and being able to solve big problems. Availability, scalability, architecting them for long-term use, for long-term lives, testing them in better and more efficient ways, because we're not being concerned about the minutia of what a for loop looks like, of how an object diagram will do a job well. In fact, it could be that we're going to be building things more functional because of AI, and we're still going to be responsible for those larger pieces. You see things like Power Apps and Power BI that are sort of doing that for some level of developer. I think the problem comes in that the AI boom sort of came in right after all these tech layoffs. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to look back and see that a lot of those tech layoffs, trying to cut costs while they thought a bust market was coming, probably are going to result in them realizing how much talent they lost, and then trying to do what only happened 2 years ago, which is this huge push to hire, and then fire. And that's been true for most of my career. I used to think, I need to have a backup plan. I built accounting systems early in my career. So it's like, I could just go do accounting if I have to, because might not need developers when it's really bad, like 87, like 2008, like 87, 2000, and 2008. But in none of those times did I actually need to worry about it, because there were programmer jobs. There's always going to be programmer jobs. Either they're trying to create new, interesting things, or they're trying to make what they're doing more efficient. And programmers and developers, whatever the term you want to use, I think are always going to be part of that process. And my hope is that you'll join me and not worry about it too much. We live in interesting times, so sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. I want you to think about, at the end of the day, what your job really is. And if you think it's typing, or you think it's lines of code, you should probably reevaluate what you think a developer really is. Thanks for joining me. I don't do these rants very often, but I appreciate you guys watching. Like and subscribe would really help me. You can do all that, and we can extend this discussion down in the comments. I will be there if you want to tell me why I'm wrong and how I'm wrong, and maybe we can both learn from it.